who was a member of the European Parliament, right up until we all had to leave, and who before that was Professor of Strategy and Sustainability at the University of Roehampton. And I think I'm right to say your main interest is in green economics. Is that correct?
You're right, which is why I'm rather disappointed Chris isn't here. I'm not an environmental expert. I am a green, but I'm not an environmental expert. Hoping you fill in the gap.
I'm going to call Molly to talk about the environment and the future of the European Union. And I shall respond briefly before opening it out, because I don't make great claims, but I was a fairly successful environmental lobbyist in Brussels in the 1990s. So I won't be up to date, but I have some knowledge of the subject. Molly,
I'm very pleased to hear that, because although I am a tree hugger, I'm not a person that's ever worked on environmental issues as such. When I was an MEP, I was on the monetary banking and monetary affairs committee, so I was sort of in Graham's department really, and I also worked on the agriculture committee, so obviously that has some overlap with what I'm going to be talking about today. It's really nice actually to be in a setting where you're not talking about Brexit and the damage it's done to the environment and environmental protection, although maybe we'll come back to that in the questions, and I've got plenty to say about that, as you can imagine. But I think trying to imagine where the EU is going on environmental policy is, it's more of an open field and an interesting one. Although I have to say personally, I'm not a great fan of crystal ball gazing, so I'll do my best with that. And I'll certainly talk about where I think the important areas of environmental policy are right now. I think the first thing to say, oh, by the way, I am the person that has a cold that came, so hopefully you're happy with that. I could go out and join you by Zoom from elsewhere, but maybe I'll stay here now that I'm here. Got my throat sweets at the ready. So yeah, I think following on from the previous session, it's very important to note that the what I'm referring to as the far right, I mean, populism is a word that has its use, but as Andrew explained, it could mean on the right or on the left. And personally, I don't particularly like it as a word because it suggests both a connection with people and that those parties are popular, neither of which I find terribly useful for my purposes. But as we know, there's a very strong and established far-right movement and far-right parties across the European Union now. And they are mobilising a backlash against a lot of the best environmental legislation that's gone through in recent years. And we see that in this country with the opening of oil fields and the rolling back of environmental protections, and there's a massive emphasis on a very small number of people who voted in the Uxbridge by-election and might have been influenced by the ULEZ scheme. You know, that's been hugely overinterpreted by the right-wing press to give the Conservatives some space to roll back a lot of the environmental protections that probably you and I have been working for decades to achieve. And they are now using the environment as a wedge issue, and they will do that in the forthcoming European elections. And I see that as a threat, a democratic threat, but also a threat to environmental protection. We've seen that from the EPP. So, you know, a little bit like we saw with Brexit, the far right made that move, sort of along the lines of the Gilets jaunes, you know, so the Greens just want to make you poorer, essentially. That's where it starts out. They don't care about you, they just want to make you poorer. And now the EPP have sort of bought into that as well. I see that as quite a dangerous coalition for my type of politics, but probably for what the European elections will look like in general. So that's a first sort of introductory comment. And the other thing to draw attention to is the European Green Deal, which is, I think, it was certainly world leading and ambitious before Biden put through the Inflation Reduction Act, which is probably the worst, skillful politics, but the worst named bill in the history of US politics, since it's not about inflation reduction. A large proportion of it is actually about developing the green economy there. And it's being very successful in doing that, although in a sort of way that favours the US economy versus other economies. So the European Green Deal undertakes that the European economy as a whole will be net zero in terms of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And that's kind of inevitable looking at the Paris Agreement. But it also says that they will decouple economic growth in Europe from use of energy and materials. That's scientifically impossible, actually. It's a nice target to have, but it's not possible to keep growing the economy without using more materials and energy. So I fear they're going to run into some difficulties there, but it's a good ambition to have. So that's why there's such a focus on the circular economy. And then there's a third commitment, which is very important politically, and that's that nobody will be left behind. And that's because there's plenty of economies across the European Union of countries that are still very dependent on the sorts of economic sectors that will be left behind as sectors as we move through the green transition. And so the commitment there is to fund those transitions in those places and to sort of not do what happened in this country under Thatcher, with whole communities being thrown on the scrap heap effectively. So that's the commitment of nobody left behind. There's been 1.8 trillion euros committed to COVID recovery, and a third of that is heading in the direction of this European Green Deal. So it's a significant investment programme in the industrial transition. So that's just by way of introduction. I'm going to talk about 5 areas, each of them quite briefly. The first one you won't be surprised to hear is about climate action. So when we talk about the Green Deal, people quite often assume that's climate, but obviously there's a lot of other activities as well: protection of marine environments, biodiversity, and so on. Now, the climate targets in the EU, they were leading, I would say, at the time of Paris, but they are not sufficient to keep us within 1.5 degrees of warming. They are not really sufficient, I think, to address climate change in any significant way, because once you get to a certain level of warming, you start seeing feedback loops. So one example might be the melting of the tundra, which then releases a lot of methane, which then exacerbates the climate, the effects of climate gas, and so on. So the targets that have been set are not strong enough in part of any countries, but we do see that in the European Union. And anyway, governments are not meeting their targets. It's clear that the UK was a leader within Europe until, well, certainly under the last Labour government when we had the Climate Change Act. But you can see now, because of that wedge issue point I talked about earlier, that this government is now abandoning that sort of leadership role. And in fact, I think if we were still in the European Union, I don't think we would have seen the opening of Rosebank, massive new oil field in the North Sea, which is going to make it impossible for us to meet our carbon targets, and also give a green light to all sorts of other countries to follow similar policies. We heard already about the change of government in Poland, and not to be too kind of optimistic about what that might mean, but I think in terms of European climate policy, it is important. I saw myself how difficult it was to get countries of Eastern Europe to agree to ambitious targets on climate action. And Poland was always the sort of main stalling block there when you got to the interinstitutional negotiations. And so this is, the change of government is important, and so is the Just Transition Fund, which is that nobody left behind point that I made earlier. We've also heard mention of CBAM. This is a typical bit of Eurospeak, isn't it? The Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. I did actually propose that when I was an MEP, and I didn't see anybody say that before I wrote that on a piece of paper. And what amazed me about it was how much it took off. Everybody was like, yeah, that's a great idea. And then I realised that the reason for that is effectively what it's saying is imports into the European Union will pay a tax that reflects the carbon intensity of the production that doesn't match European standards, where we're decarbonising. But at the same, so European industry is like, yeah, fantastic idea, because it's like a form of legitimate protectionism, really, climate protectionism. But at the same time, they weren't so keen to reduce their CO2 emissions to match. So that's why I am a fan of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and I think it's a game changer actually. But I only, obviously only if there's genuine and measurable carbon reductions by industry. And the reason it's a game changer is it's starting to export high European environmental standards. And we could see similar policies in other areas, including human rights areas. So the European single market wouldn't accept goods that hadn't met standards of civil rights. For example, almost everything produced in China. Anyway, I leave that hanging. And last point to make about climate crisis, which is bringing in an issue that hasn't been covered very much during this conference, and that's the relationship between the climate crisis and migration. So a lot of people we already see migrating into the European Union are being driven out of their homes because of the climate crisis, making life, making the places they used to live uninhabitable. Some people come because they've seen on the TV how great it is to live here and they just want a better life. But a lot of people literally can no longer survive in the way they used to be happy to live because of the climate crisis making life impossible. So in my view, as pro-Europeans, we need to find a positive narrative around migration, and I don't find that very difficult to do because, well, I'm not going to say how old I am, but we are an aging population in this country, and the birth rate has fallen quite dramatically right across Europe in recent years. And so actually we do need younger people forming part of our workforce. So I think personally, both in terms of free movement, but also in terms of migration, I think we need to completely reverse the argument there. It's definitely a benefit for us to have young, enthusiastic people coming in. So enough about climate, as if that wasn't a massive enough topic in itself. A quick word on nature and biodiversity. Back in July, the nature restoration law was passed, and it was a great achievement, but I believe it passed by only 7 votes the second time it went through the European Parliament. And it was a real struggle to get it passed, and it was considerably watered down. And that's again about that coalition between the right and the far right that I was talking about, opposing opposing environmental protections. In fact, the EPP referred to it as, quoting, an attack on European agriculture, forestry and fisheries. And this is really important, that this is now being claimed, not here opportunities to farm in a different way and to farm in a way that's supportive of nature, let's say, but actually trying to pit these two against each other, which isn't necessary, but it is necessary unless we change the way agriculture works at the moment. So the objectives of the nature restoration law include that 20% of land and sea, which is currently in poor quality, has to be restored by 2050, and also stopping the loss of green urban spaces. So we're not just talking about stopping things where they are now, we're talking about actually restoring nature, restoring peatlands, restoring environments, say, where you might have monoculture, forestry, making sure that you have biodiverse woodlands and so on. So this is a very ambitious project, and I would say it's one of the high points of this Parliament where Greens have been very powerful. So we had good election results last time around, whereas this time around I fear that some of the votes that came to us will now go to the far right. And so we've got some good law on the statute books, but how long it will survive, I think, is a question. Well, obviously a question for the voters. We won't vote this time, but a lot of Europeans will next May. So just a quick word on agriculture. I did sit on that committee and it absolutely astonished me. That was where all the lobbying was. It's not surprising because it's where half the European budget is, as I'm sure everybody here knows, but having sitting on the committee that oversaw banking and finance across the European Union, I thought that's where the lobbying power was. No way. It was in the agriculture committee. That was where all the interest was, and those were the seats that people really wanted to have. And I would say that the impact of the common agricultural policy on the environment has been largely, almost entirely negative. And obviously I was strong pro-European, and I argued very strongly in the referendum campaign that we shouldn't be European Union, but it was very hard to justify the common agricultural policy and its impacts. And when we left, I immediately proposed a much more environmentally supported system of farm payments, which actually, again, I definitely wasn't responsible for the Conservatives picking that up. I know that, but it was quite aligned to what Michael Gove said, but not to what the Conservatives then introduced. But paying farmers rather than by production, regardless of how much the environment's damaged, actually paying them to protect the environment, and particularly shifting towards a regenerative agriculture system where nature and production go hand in hand. Anyway, we haven't seen that introduced into law, but that was an opportunity then. I mean, I hope the EU is going to move in that direction over the next 10 years, but given the power of both the agriculture lobby, agribusiness and the chemical industry, I have my doubts, and I fear we may see the same sort of agriculture persisting. And that's a real problem, because land is crucially important, not just because of biodiversity, but also because of the need to farm in a way that captures CO2. We haven't yet seen, when we say net zero, we're talking about, we will still be emitting CO2, but it has to be captured back by some process. At the moment, the focus is mostly on carbon capture and storage, but it isn't working at scale yet. So it's kind of a little bit like, well, we'll sort that out when we get there, but we're already there. Whereas land-based carbon capture is what nature does. Peatlands is the best example, but also organic farming, deep swards, as we say in the West Country. That's the kind of farming, and the land is essential in ensuring that kind of land-based carbon capture. Quick word on sustainable finance, which is where I overlap with Graham. I did quite a lot of work on that as the Parliament's rapporteur on sustainable finance. I kind of took those ideas into the Parliament, and some bits of law have been successfully passed and are operational, and I'm now sort of in my private research capacity investigating how they're working out, which is mixed as you'd expect. But I think the most powerful thing that was changed was what's called mandatory disclosure, which means that companies have to report to shareholders the actual environmental impacts of their activities, and then finance companies have to report the environmental impacts of the companies that they're investing in. And so this is really transforming the investment landscape, because investors, companies, financial companies and individuals can now see the environmental and climate impacts of their money, which previously they weren't able to, which I found a bit extraordinary. But so there's a lot more transparency. And actually, if you combine that transparency with legal changes, you can see a sort of pincer movement where if you change the law, certain activities become stranded assets in financial terms. So a lot of non-organic agriculture is actually destroying its own base, because the land is becoming so unproductive that over time you won't be able to grow food there anymore. And so if you sort of see that then as a stranded asset financially, then you can start to use the two tools of finance policy and agriculture policy to move the economy in a more sustainable direction. And my final point is about trade, and I think this is very important in terms of the UK, because I don't know about you, but I've been a bit suspicious about these farcical trade deals that have been signed with a tiny impact on GDP. So I used to think, you know, they're just fools. But no, I think maybe what's going on there is a deliberate attempt to undermine our environmental rules so that we are diverging from the EU, and so that it's harder to join, because the various trade deals have, in different ways with regard to animal standards and environmental standards, actually undermined. So although we haven't changed our laws necessarily, products coming in here now will have those standards, and that will create a pressure to undermine the protections that the EU has and that we did enjoy. And that anything that moves towards divergence makes it harder for us to be members of the European Union in the future. So I think we should all keep our eye on that. But more broadly, in terms of the future of the EU, I see an important development here, because I would say that trade policy is the main way that there's leakage in terms of environmental policies. So, you know, you can set whatever standards you like across the European land mass and across the single market. But if you're importing goods that are causing environmental damage elsewhere, then, you know, you're sort of undermining your industry and not achieving your environmental objectives. And perhaps the most important example of that is the Amazon rainforest, where, you know, on the one hand, European politicians might make a lot of song and dance about the damage that's being done, but on the other hand, we'll be importing the beef and the soya that's grown on the land that's being deforested. So I think ensuring that environmental protections of the same level we have in Europe are made a part of all future trade deals, and in a way that's legally actionable, is crucial in providing genuine environmental protection. And another piece of EU law that's a kind of favourite of mine, which I think also shows the way that the EU might be able to go, is the Conflict Mineral Directive, which again makes it illegal for 3 metals beginning with T, which I can't remember, gold, 3T2, they call it, tantalum, titanium, so you can't import those from areas where there's conflict, or where the mining of them might go to feed future conflicts. And that again is, I think, is a model for the sort of law that we could follow. So banning the imports of materials that go into industry in the EU, or products that contain those materials, unless they reach the standard of environmental and social protection that we would expect in the EU. We have to do that in a way that doesn't impoverish countries that have depended on trade with us. But I think it's a way we can use, I say they, whatever, can use strong environmental protections to actually change on a global basis the standards of environmental protection and indeed social protection and human rights. So that's probably enough to be chewing over.
Yes.
I'm very interested to hear what you're going to say as well.
Thank you very much. As I mentioned, in the 90s, for a while, I earned my living as an environmental lobbyist, lobbying, in particular, the Environment Committee of the European Parliament, as well as the Commission, but the Parliament mainly. Now, about 10 years ago, I was at a party in Denmark, and I was a bit upset because there were a lot of young people there who were totally against the European Union. And I was quite surprised. And I asked them, and they were environmental activists. And they had this very simple view that the European Union is a capitalist plot and its devotion to economic growth is bad for the environment. So I tried to explain to them the record of the European Union on the environment, which, is my business. And why, in fact, you could see that the European Union was an important force on the environment. And I'll just briefly say the first bit of environmental legislation was 1979 Birds Directive. Now, at that point, the member states had not given responsibility for the environment to the European Union, but there was a general power if everybody agreed that you could do something. And that's how it was done. Then we get the Single European Act, and specific power, the competence to do with the environment comes in. I actually remember before that came in, organising a conference at which my guest speaker was a man called Stanley Johnson. Never met his son, but he was running what was the Environment Agency at the European Commission at the time, which was quite small at that time, but obviously grew into a huge Directorate General later. And the European Union started to act collectively on environmental matters. This was particularly important when international treaties were being negotiated. Member states worked together. They'd have common spokesmen, they'd meet together. The famous example quite early on is the Montreal Protocol, that some of you remember. I've also attended one of the United Nations climate change conferences, the one that was very disappointing in Copenhagen. But again, the European member states worked together on these issues. And that was a very useful thing. Some of the environmental protection that's needed imposes costs on producers. And the danger always was, if you left it to member states, that they would protect their own producers and they wouldn't agree to have higher standards of environmental protection. But by doing it at European level, you could get agreement. You could do things that wouldn't have happened at individual member state level. And another thing that's not talked about very much, but I think is quite important, is the institution that doesn't get as much attention, and that's the Court of Justice. There were attempts, there's a famous German lawnmower case, where the German lawnmower manufacturers said they'd got this wonderful idea for a bit of environmental protection, which was to limit the amount of noise that lawnmowers would cause. What they were actually doing was trade protection, because if they could get the law through that said you've got to meet a certain standard, they were ready to produce the machines that would meet the standard, and other countries wouldn't be. Now, the result of that case, and many, many cases since, is that the Court of Justice has developed a whole body of jurisprudence for working out when something is really trade protection and when it's environmental protection. This is very useful, not only because, of course, it helps with environmental protection, it's very useful for people in business because they've got a whole body of jurisprudence to know what they can do and what they can't do. At world level, where you've got disputes settled through the WTO, that body of jurisprudence doesn't exist. So I think that's an important function of the union, that its Court of Justice has been able to separate those two issues. And I'm not a specialist in how it's done it, but employers who follow this thing, there is a substantial body of law there. When we had the referendum, most of the argument that all these sort of professional pundits said, you've got to talk about the economy. And I always said, well, most people don't follow economic arguments. They're interested in economic outcomes. And the economy arguments are overwhelming, but we have to talk about other things. And one of the other things was the environment. Because it's perfectly clear, and polling has supported this, everybody can see that you can't solve environmental problems in one country. They cross boundaries. When there used to be, what's it called, the poll that was conducted every 6 months by the European Union. Eurobarometer. Well, one of their regular questions was, which competences you think should be at European level. And one of the ones that strongly scored highly with the public regularly was the environment, and particularly climate change, as that got better known. this was something people could understand, and I think we should have made much more of it during the referendum. And it continues to be the case that a lot of the action people would like to see in the environment needs to be taken at a supranational level, and the European Union is interested in doing that. There was a lot of fear amongst some of us that following Brexit, that the environmental protections that have been developed would gradually be undermined in the name of independence and national sovereignty. And I suspect most of you will remember quite recently, the government kept going on about how wonderful Brexit was and all these benefits that they sent Rees-Mogg to look for. And they finally came up with one. And it was that the judgment of the European Court meant that you could refuse planning permission for housing because the housing might pollute a river. Now, as a matter of fact, it was the way that in Britain we implemented the judgment. It didn't have to be implemented that way. But they used it as an argument, look, now we're independent, we can we don't have to take any notice of this anymore. That was fought. A lot of environmentalists said, we don't want more pollution, whereas the government said, well, it's a very small amount that comes from housing estates. The pollution is mainly from agriculture and industry. They made a simple procedural mistake. They proposed their change in the House of Lords. And the House of Lords threw it out. And because it had been proposed there, it couldn't go into ping pong and go back to the Commons, so it was defeated. But I think it was a proxy argument. I don't think people were really arguing so much about that particular decision. It was about don't take away our environmental protections. It was a more general issue of people being afraid of those all going. So that's just a quick survey of a few points, but I think the basic argument for there being environmental competence at the European Union level remains true. And I think from things I've read recently, again, I've referred to it before, von der Leyen's State of the Union speech, she talks about the environment and what the Union is going to do. Now, it will never be perfect because you're always fighting with other interests. But I think the European Union will continue to have a role there, and it will be more successful than just trying to do it at member state level. So I see that as, I think it will grow as well. I can't convince anybody about that, but I think we're going to find in the next 10 years that it's an issue. Obviously, climate change, there are a few skeptics around still, I think, but I think we're going to see that area grow and the European Union taking a role in it. So let me open it up to everybody else. Over there, please.
That's a short question. The European Union recently passed the deforestation law. Having read its provisions, it seems like a very good piece of legislation. However, it is leading to significant tensions with developing countries, namely Indonesia, Malaysia, because they're big palm oil producers, of course. And their argument is that it really results in a sort of loss of a lot of jobs, a lot of poverty arises potentially because of this law. Can you comment on that? The EU needs to balance, obviously, environment, deforestation is part of it, an important part of it, and the EU's relations with developing countries, particularly with the rise of sort of geopolitics and how to deal with sort of China and Russia and how to play also with the developing world and keep them on side. The deforestation law, whilst environmentally is very positive from the EU's relations geopolitically, however, it could be a big drawback.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you. And Monet, I was very pleased to get your support on the financials of pincer movement on both sides. You may not be aware that just recently, in fact last week, the Commission published its platform on sustainability stuff, which is doing a Q&A, a rolling Q&A on how exactly people will use the taxonomy to define various problems and identify really practical issues and come up with solutions to it. So this is really filling in the detail. Now, I made the point, and maybe you react to it, that the UK is still at the point of discussing whether or not, or when we should consult on our own rules. And we've talked about Brexit taking back control in such a large and important area. It's just a complete nonsense.
Can I take one more and then we'll ask Wally over here.
Yes, if I can draw on both your experiences, I mean, while you mentioned Poland encouraging movements there and possibly new dynamics, but we've also seen recent election results in the Netherlands with the rise of the Farmers' Party. And we've also seen maybe pure internal politics and maybe party politics. We've seen pushback on the part of the EPP, the mainstream centre-right family in the European Parliament, against actually what arguably is an EPP project led by von der Leyen on the Green Deal. So my question is, we've got a new EU climate chief who comes from the Christian Democrat family and the Dutch Christian Democrat, former Shell oil employee, so it's on, I suspect, on trial. But some people are seeing the shift in the centre-right away from supporting environmental policy as pure politics ahead of the European elections. But equally, some people in Brussels are saying, to the centre-right, that there's been too much environmental legislation that hasn't been properly transposed and implemented at member state levels. So why are we shoveling more and more stuff down towards the member states when what's already in the pipeline hasn't been properly processed? Essentially, how does one this side of the European election convince the mainstream centre-right to not shift into a hard right position of anti-Europeanism and seek to keep them on board? Because whether one likes it or not, you're going to need the EPP on board to see a meaningful green transition in the European Union.
Thanks. So I think what you asked about the deforestation law is a parallel to what I was saying about the Amazon and the Mercosur deal and importing the products of deforested land. And I think while I was an MEP, I helped write a green trade policy, which is called Green Trade for All. And that is like the long form version, which I'll give you a very short summary of my answer here. But effectively, the argument is we cannot deal with environmental problems unless we change the way that the European Union organises its trade policy, which is effectively to support European industry and European business. And you know, there's no point if you're going to do that and argue that trade can help to make poverty history, then you're not going to be able to have your environmental policy as well. So in other words, you need to rethink trade policy to take account of what you're saying and what I was saying about the Amazon, because yeah, otherwise you're right, geopolitically we're just losing the support of countries, because it's kind of like, well, you said I could get out of poverty through using trade, but now you're making trade impossible because of your environmental standards. So I'm just going to, you know, I'm abandoning confidence in the European Union. And I think the trade policy is actually a serious risk to European credibility across the world at the moment. The taxonomy. Thank you for bringing up the taxonomy, Graham. For those that aren't following sustainable finance as closely as Graham and myself, the taxonomy is like an amazing imaginative project from Martin Spolz, who is an excellent Czech civil servant in the finance department. And effectively, what the beautiful vision was to define what's green and what isn't, really. So then if you wanted to say, well, this is a green bond or this is a green investment product, you would be able to say that because a certain proportion of it was invested in these green sectors. But obviously, it's a bit like trying to make a Linnaean taxonomy of the whole of the economy. And to be honest, it was probably always doomed to failure. It's a great ambition, but so far they haven't even managed to pin down what that would mean in terms of the first two sectors, which is climate adaptation and climate mitigation. So it's an extremely ambitious project. I agree with what you're saying, which is that the EU government says, like for everything, we won't have the ETS, you know, we won't have the European emission trading system. We'll have the British emission trading system. We won't have REACH. We'll have British REACH. We won't have EU taxonomy. We'll have UK taxonomy. And actually, mostly what's happened is we've ended up just cutting and pasting EU law. Or when we've tried to do something different, for example, REACH, which is the chemicals directive, they tried to change away from, you know, to use that Brexit freedom to change away from the European law, and the industry immediately came back and said, well, we don't want two standards because that's just going to waste money having to, you know, meet two types of regulation. And so it seems, I mean, that's run into the sand. And it seems that, we'll get a change of government and we'll just stick with EU reach. But on the taxonomy, I think actually, I mean, I'm paying a bit of attention to this and I'm hoping to find out more soon, but I think there is actually a way in which the UK could do that better, just by being sort of more pragmatic. And the same with the mandatory disclosure, which is called SFDR. Ours is called SDR, but I think the mandatory disclosure is also overcomplicated. And I think it's possible that the UK could come up with a more pragmatic approach to both of those that would be better, but the UK's SDR won't be mandatory, so therefore it will be pointless. But anyway, you're right. Why haven't we seen anything on that? They've promised consultation this autumn, haven't they? So maybe we will see something. But as a project, it's very important that you are able to define what's a green investment and what isn't a green investment. Otherwise, you just have greenwashing, and unfortunately quite a lot of this is descending into greenwashing at the moment. So anyway, let's be optimistic about what our civil servants might be able to achieve. On the farming point, yes, actually it's quite interesting for those of you who've been here and then gone to work in Brussels in the Parliament or as a lobbyist or in any other capacity. I think you immediately have a very different view of different countries, and I have this very idealistic view of the Netherlands. I don't know quite where it came from, probably like, childhood dolls or something, but that changed very rapidly once I became an MEP, and particularly because of their approach to agriculture, which is very inimical to the sort of regenerative agriculture I was talking about. And I think, so it doesn't surprise me what you're saying about the Netherlands approach to agriculture, but I would be a bit more sceptical about where the EPP is at. I think that's a general electoral bid, and I think they'll stick with it. They didn't like having to agree with us, as Greens, on a lot of the environmental legislation that's gone through. It's just that the temperature was quite high, and they didn't think they would be able to. Obviously they watered a lot of it down significantly, but they didn't think they'd get away with scuppering it all together. We had Greta Thunberg in the Parliament and kids walking on the streets. On climate responses, they felt they had to act. I don't think they feel that pressure anymore. And that is a worry. And also, of course, the other side of that is that there's a massive fight back by the fossil fuel industry now. They've abandoned climate denialism and they're moving into like transition fuels and just general pressure and rhetoric. And this rhetoric around making people poorer is part of their rhetoric. So if you think about it, this is something else that I suppose naively I didn't anticipate until I was active in European politics, and that's that the EPP and also to a large extent the Liberals in European context think that their job is just to help industry. So if industry say we need X, look, the MEPs probably think that's their job to deliver X. And in fact, they lobbied me from the city to say, you have to deliver this because the city needs it. I was kind of like, actually, I'm a Green MEP representing South West England. I'm not going to do that. But I think if the fossil fuel industry says that's what they need, my worry would be that the EPP and Renew, as they are now, would feel bound to deliver that. And then if you've got another bloc that's far right, which is opposing climate change action, I'm getting more pessimistic than you are, but I think you could see backward moves even in the height of the crisis. That's my concern anyway, depending on how the elections turn out, obviously.
I could add a bit on Tim's question, because I think my main point is that you're asking what arguments will work with the mainstream right. Well, I don't think the mainstream right is uniform. I think it's different in different countries, and the arguments that will work will be different for different people. I'll give a small example. My biggest victory in Brussels was stopping the French from breaking the birds directive. They had failed to transpose it effectively. The French law, actually, people were going around shooting birds whenever they wanted to. And a French environmental organization took the French government to court over their failure to transpose the directive properly. Now, if that hadn't been a European directive, it had just been, hunters against environmentalists, that would probably be the end of it. The hunters had formed a political party in France. They were winning elections. But the European court said, no, you haven't transposed it properly. So the hunters went to the politicians, the right-wing politicians in France, who went to Jacques Delors, who was president of the commission. And they said, right, we won't change our law in France, we'll change the European directive so that what the French are doing is okay. And Delors tried to push through a change in the law by the emergency procedure. It was going to go through fast. Well, we stopped that. And we actually got the law improved, so that they failed in their attempt to do that. I imagine the French hunters are now breaking the new law instead of the old one. I have to check. But one of the points about that, it comes back to what I said about different arguments to different people. At that time, as far as I know, and I checked fairly carefully, there were two biologists in the European Parliament. One was my wife, and she wasn't a member of the Parliament, she was working there. So what the ornithologists wanted me to do was to use all the scientific arguments. But guess what? The hunters have got their scientists as well. So it's about choosing your arguments, who you're talking to. And I didn't use the science arguments. I used different arguments which would appeal to the European Parliament. And I think that's true of all lobbying. You should talk to people about things they understand more than things they don't understand. But I don't think it's uniform. That's my main point. I accept there's going to be resistance. But one's got to, you've got to box clever. You've got to pick your people and use the right arguments. So next question, please. Yeah, first, and then Richard.
Yes. My question is about checks and balances. How much of the monitoring is going on of how the greenwashing is taking place in relation to those 5 objectives, for example, and then the new Green Deal in more general terms? Because from my perspective, I'm an urbanist, so I'm looking at nature-based solutions and all that sort of stuff. But we found that when I tried to look at the European literature, it was extremely vague, and there were no dates. There were no, what is actually the Green Deal? Has it been voted through? It wasn't really very clear. And then they had all these kind of pilot projects and this and that and the other. And so that my question is about a bit more clarity about also checks and balances and how you can actually monitor of how the more negative impacts of any intervention of positive interventions are taking place and how they're being dealt with. What sanctioning mechanisms there are, if at any.
Thank you.
I'm going to abuse this opportunity to be slightly anecdotal. In the mid-1980s, I was in a group of civil servants in Brussels negotiating on chemicals, and we were all called in to a little office with Stanley Johnson. And he gave us a long lecture on the environment. And we were completely nonplussed. It was all complete. We had no idea about this at all. We didn't know what he was expecting us to do about it. So I'm afraid we didn't do anything about it. But anyway, Stanley Johnson it was. And the other one is two other things completely irrelevant. My only achievement as a lobbyist in Brussels was to deal with the Greek treatment of conscientious objectors who were being maltreated. That's a completely different issue. And the last one is that the thing I just read about recently is that the Romanians want to join Schengen, and under unanimous legislation, only the Dutch are preventing this, and it turns out this is entirely an internal political debate within the Netherlands, nothing to do with the issue of Schengen. It's just an example of slight disadvantages of the Brussels system.
Any more questions before we go back? Oh yes, sorry, I didn't see.
Yep. Well, you talked about the way in which, in opinion polling, protection of the environment, climate change, loom large in people's preoccupations. The trouble with the electorate is that the electorate is capable of holding contradictory positions at the same time. And one of those positions is that the expense of meeting these problems shouldn't fall on me and my family. Now, that's a caricature, but it's because there is some truth in that caricature that there is a resonance that can be found with a certain kind of populist rhetoric, which says climate change, green revolution are a preoccupation of the elitist, probably Remainer in this country, middle class. How do you think most effectively such political rhetoric will be combated?
So Let me start with your question about monitoring. I completely agree with you. I mean, the thing is, as a politician, you sit there and you're really careful about tiny this word, no, that word, you know. And then what happens? It goes out there, and it wasn't actually my job to do the monitoring. But one of the things I did try to do, for example, one of the bits of sustainable finance legislation is about benchmarks. I mean, basically, they're financial indexes. So people choose the companies that go in them, and then money automatically flows in. It's a simplistic way of describing it. But if you don't know what the actual impact is of what the companies are doing, then you might just have a policy saying we're going to do everything we can to address the climate crisis. That might be considered enough. So into that piece of law, we wrote that it had to be scientifically verifiable, and so they had to read the trajectory of this, CO2 reductions over time in order to be able to be part of that index. But your question is a very good one, because who's checking whether they are actually reaching those targets? Now, I think my answer would be, and I think this is how a lot of EU legislation is actually enforced, somebody who isn't in that index and therefore isn't receiving those funds would have to take a legal case challenging their right to be there. I think actually a lot of European law does depend on that. And as you give an example of companies doing that, I had an example with James Dyson, who came to me because he'd lost a legal case over his I said Hoover when I was there, gone to the trouble, vacuum cleaner, because it didn't have a bag, so it's similar kind of getting around the rules by having a bag or a vacuum cleaner, the law didn't really apply. But I think a lot of it does depend on that. And so my question, which I asked some of the people working on sustainable finance, is, well, when are you going to take the legal cases? And I mean, that's what they'll have to do. I don't know whether they will do that. Oh yes, I didn't really have an answer to your anecdote, so I could share anecdotes, but I won't. On the opinion polls, yes, I actually think there is an easy answer to this question, and it's actually Green Party policies. You won't be surprised to hear me say that, but the answer is we should be paying for example, the insulation of people's homes. Actually, Labour have that as a policy as well. The fastest way to reduce our CO2 emissions would be to stop people's energy leaking out of their homes. We have some of the worst homes in Europe, and it's also easier to organise the retrofit on a street by street basis, replacing windows, insulating walls and so on. I've had that done in my own house. It's quite remarkable, the difference. And of course, installing heat pumps. This should be done at public expense. Yes, yeah. And you should start with the people on the lowest incomes, and often they also have the worst housing. So we did actually launch a whole policy on that at our conference, which I won't bore you with, but effectively that's the answer. And I don't think there is that inconsistency, actually. I think people are extremely worried about the climate crisis. They do understand what's happening, and they're particularly worried about future generations and what they'll have to live through. But if you see what comes out of, rather than polling, which is after all a bit of a yes/no exercise, if you look at the Parliament's Climate Assembly, there were some really interesting outcomes there. So people supported higher charges for flights. For example, after the first flight per year, they supported a frequent flyer levy. They supported higher energy prices as well, as long as they had insulation. So actually their bills would be lower, although each unit of energy would be more costly. So I'm a lot more optimistic than you are about that, because I think when people are sitting down in a setting where they have experts coming in, they have time to think it through, they discuss it between themselves, they actually do support much more ambitious climate policies. The problem is we don't have that as part of our democratic system. So we just go back to, oh, the Uxbridge by-election shows this, let's abandon our environmental targets. But that's a problem with our democracy, as we discussed in the previous session. That's neither a politician's problem or a people's problem, in my view. That's a political system problem. And both changing the electoral system and ensuring we have more deliberative democracy built in would really help there, I think. And climate crisis is an excellent example of a policy area that is very complicated, and the trade-offs are serious and it's urgent. So that's why they set up the Climate Assembly. And I think it's a good example of where that type of democracy would be really constructive.
Do we have any more questions? I wanted to add one thing, which is certainly when I was young, I think everybody in this room as well, the environment wasn't considered political. In 1960, my headmaster bought me a copy of Rachel Carlton's Silent Spring. It was so non-political that Prince Charles could talk about it as much as he liked. Now, that has changed totally. The environment is very political. I did at one point lobby on behalf of a collection of regions across Europe. And when I moved from that to an environmental organisation, a councillor from Sheffield or something said, "Oh, you missed the politics, David." No, there was more politics in the environment than in the regional policy, actually.
Can I just add something to that, which is to say, I mean, to me, the climate crisis is happening, it's accelerating, it's going to be the most serious issue facing both myself, and I'm not going to say how old I am, but you know, future generations particularly. So that's not a question, but the question is, how do you deal with it? Do you deal with it through industry, through the market? Do you deal with it through social change, like more public transport, or do you deal with it through electric vehicles? That's where the debate should be. And what distresses me at the moment is we used to have consensus. Yes, we'll address the climate crisis, but rather than arguing for more market-based solutions, let's say, they're now arguing against climate action. That is very disturbing. So it's become political. It used to be political in a more useful way between right and left, suggesting different solutions, as you would expect. But now it's becoming more of a political football. I just hope that after the next election that stops.
John, you wanted to?
Well, I just wanted to ask a follow-up question on that point, which is, surely what is required is a very clear idea of what climate change is likely to mean on the ground. I mean, I partly live in Spain, and there has been for a long time concern over water, over very hot summers, very cold winters. I mean, where I spend a lot of time, we've had the hottest summer on record, but we also had last winter an extremely cold winter. We've also had the highest level of rainfall for 20 years. The only slight problem is that it's come in, well, some of it came in 48 hours. And so the debate in Spain, the debate is climate change going to lead to desertification, or is the warming of the Mediterranean going to lead to more precipitation than one needs? There's so much, there's not an explanation on that. Another example is something which I've never succeeded in getting to the bottom of so far, is the risk to the Gulf Stream going to lead to us cooling or warming? I mean, the beginning of getting popular support for measures. I mean, you mentioned the Netherlands too. I mean, the debate about the risk of seawater, of sea level rise, and what needs to be done about that. I mean, surely the beginning of getting a cross-party and depoliticizing, if you like, this question, is to have a really serious popular understanding of what the challenge truly is. And that seems to be curiously missing from all of this at the moment. And it doesn't seem to be sufficient.
So there's lots of reasons the climate crisis is very difficult to deal with, but one is unpredictability. So there isn't an answer to that question. The climate systems are so complex that there's also, so when you see an IPCC report, it's giving you the probability of different future scenarios. That's the best scientists can do, because the nature of complex interrelating feedback means that actually we can't answer your question. It's, you know, I mean, I can't remember the probability that the Gulf Stream will fail. It's already significantly down, and we're already seeing the impact of that on our weather system. But that doesn't mean you can say next year it'll be 3 degrees higher.
No, sure not. But it does seem to be that there isn't yet a sufficient debate about what are the precise challenges that we might be meeting. Clearly, there are a range of options, but in order to focus attention on the measures that we need to be taken and where investment should go, I'm surprised that given the fact that there's a general awareness that something is going seriously awry, you only have to look at the weather. But there doesn't seem to be, this hasn't been channeled yet by the political leadership into focusing on particular options and particular alternatives, even though you've got, maybe I'm wrong about that.
Well, so if you look at the work of the Climate Change Committee, so we've got mitigation, right? So reducing CO2 emissions. We're very clear about the need to do that. We're actually making progress there, not in the transport sector, but in the energy sector, we've made good progress. The Climate Change Committee, they have a carbon budget for every year, every 5 years they have to report on that. You know, there is serious action there. I think the bit that's more complicated is adaptation, because like we know there'll be floods, and we don't know where there'll be floods or when. We know there'll be extremely high, you know, there'll be some summers where people die of the heat, but again, we don't know where or when. So I think that does make it hard to plan. But for example, we are making sure that buildings now can deal with extreme heat. we're reducing people's ability to put water out, so you have to have sustainable urban drainage systems. So when there are flash floods, we'll be able to deal with that. So, but I think the fact that I'm sitting here saying this and answering your question as well, like this is all really obvious to me, does really speak to the second part of your question, which is why don't people know this? And I think, I mean, I see Roger Harrabin every year at Glastonbury, and he's retired from the BBC now. He was their environment editor, and we used to chinwag about this every year. You know, well, we still do, but he's not at the BBC now. And he would sort of say, you don't understand how difficult it is. Firstly, to get my editor to buy the story because it's kind of like depressing, so people don't want to hear about it. Secondly, because of the unpredictability, you can't say this is going to happen, do this. So again, that's difficult to report. And yeah, I think the third thing is just keeping it in the news. You know, so there's a flood, so you can say like yesterday, you know, today, oh, there are floods, but then actually linking that to what we need to do and continually saying we need to make these changes when there aren't floods, again, makes it very difficult. So it's going to be the reality of the rest of our lives and future generations' lives. But yeah, it's going to keep coming back so often that people are sort of bored with it. I think that makes it difficult to keep it in the news as well. But I do think that we do know what we need to do on CO2 reduction, and we have had significant success there. And it distresses me a lot that this government is reversing that, but nonetheless, progress there. On the adaptation, we are just going to have to do that everywhere with the street by street insulation. And again, Labour has a pretty good plan on that. It's not ambitious enough, it's not big enough, it's not fast enough. But I do think we'll have a Labour government within a year, and I do think we'll have Ed Miliband in charge of us. And even though I'm a Green, I'm giving a sigh of relief about that.
We do have some movement in that the BBC has now decided that they don't have to have somebody denying climate change on every time that somebody.
Oh, we won that battle 5 years ago, and we do have.
But every 5, you know, it's.
Yes, sure.
It's a recent.
And it was a long battle, but we do have a climate change.
Yeah.
You know, guy there now, Justin Rowler, who
Yeah.
that's his job, and Channel 4 News have a new person. So we are making progress there, but I still think you make an important point. People are not clear about what they have to do. But then we don't have government information films, do we? Which I find extraordinary. You don't even have something saying, look, it's going to be hot, shut your curtains. Basic stuff is not being communicated. And we all agree about that. Why aren't they engaging that? But do you remember that last winter, there was going to be an energy awareness campaign, which just explained to you how to improve insulation, how to use less energy. And again, that was scuppered by Rishi Sunak. So that's partly why people don't know, because the government's choosing not to tell them. So there might be supporters of the government industry. So make it clear, I'm not one of those.
I wanted to add one problem before we stop, which is somebody brought up the subject of migration, which we haven't talked about very much today. But one of the impacts of climate change, I feel, is going to be not only external migration, people from outside the European Union trying to get in. I think there'll be internal migration as well. Because
out of East Anglia, you mean?
well, there are going to be places, it's not just coasts. Something I realized some years ago, there are areas around the Alps, for example, that depend upon the amount of water, the snow that melts every spring. The agriculture depends on it. There's not going to be as much water. So people who are earning a living there are going to find it harder. I think we're going to find external and internal migration.
But on this front, we are pretty lucky to live here,
Yes.
actually, apart from the Gulf Stream.
If there are no further questions, would you join me, please, in thanking Molly?